The cruelest revenge is making someone realize your worth only after they've lost you. The first thing everyone noticed was the silence around Claire Bennett. It followed her through the grand ballroom like an invisible shadow while crystal chandeliers scattered warm golden light across polished marble floors, and the soft melody of a string quartet floated beneath the conversations of nearly 300 guests dressed in tailored tuxedos and elegant evening gowns. Nobody walked over to greet her. Nobody asked her to join a table. They simply looked, whispered, and looked again. Some recognized her immediately. Others only remembered fragments of an old story they had heard years before. The woman who used to be married to the groom. The woman who disappeared after the divorce. The woman everyone assumed never recovered. Claire stood alone near the back of the reception hall in a navy blue evening dress that carried no designer logo anyone could recognize. Her jewelry was understated. A simple bracelet rested around her wrist, catching the light whenever she adjusted the small ivory invitation still resting between her fingers. Her expression revealed almost nothing. No anger. No sadness. Just a calmness that seemed strangely out of place in a room filled with celebration. Across the ballroom, Ethan Carter laughed louder than anyone else. His tailored black tuxedo fit perfectly, and confidence radiated from every gesture he made as he guided his beautiful fiancée, Vanessa Brooks, through clusters of smiling guests eager to congratulate them before the ceremony officially began. Vanessa looked exactly like someone who enjoyed being admired. Her diamond engagement ring flashed beneath every chandelier, as though it demanded attention from every corner of the room. She leaned closer to Ethan and whispered something that made him grin before both of them turned toward Claire. Their eyes met from across the ballroom. Ethan smiled first. It was polite enough that no stranger would question it, but Claire recognized the satisfaction hiding underneath. Vanessa followed his gaze, then offered Claire a sympathetic smile that somehow felt colder than open hostility. Moments later, the couple began walking directly toward her. Conversations nearby gradually faded as curious guests sensed something worth watching. A few phones quietly appeared above cocktail glasses, pretending to check messages while secretly recording the encounter. Vanessa stopped only a few feet away. "Claire," she said warmly, almost too warmly. "I'm honestly glad you came." Ethan nodded with practiced confidence. "It means a lot that we can all move forward." Claire simply smiled. "Congratulations." Her voice remained gentle, steady, impossible to read. Vanessa instinctively lifted her left hand while brushing a strand of blonde hair behind her ear, allowing the enormous diamond ring to catch another burst of light. "Thank you," she replied. "Some stories really do get happy endings." Several nearby guests exchanged knowing smiles. Someone quietly chuckled. Another guest whispered that Claire had come alone after all. Ethan glanced briefly toward the ballroom entrance before looking back at Claire. "I hope this isn't too uncomfortable," he said. "Life has a funny way of working out." Claire held his gaze for only a second before answering softly. "It certainly does." Her words carried no bitterness. That unsettled Ethan more than any accusation could have. He had expected resentment. He had prepared for awkwardness. Instead, she offered peace, the kind that could never be faked. Neither Ethan nor Vanessa noticed that every few moments Claire's eyes drifted toward the enormous front doors of the ballroom, as though she were quietly waiting for someone. Outside, hidden beyond the towering glass entrance, the low purr of an approaching engine echoed across the circular driveway. A uniformed valet immediately straightened his posture. Another hurried toward the curb. Through the glass, only the reflection of polished black paint could be seen before the vehicle came to a smooth stop beneath the entrance canopy. Inside, no guest had yet turned to notice. Claire did not move. She simply took one slow breath, folded the invitation into her hand, and allowed the smallest smile to touch her lips for the very first time that evening. The sound of the engine outside seemed to dissolve into the distance as Claire kept her eyes on Ethan, but inside her mind another sound returned instead, one she had not heard in years. It was the cheerful clatter of dishes in a tiny apartment kitchen where two people once believed love could overcome anything. Long before elegant ballrooms and polished marble floors, there had been a cramped one-bedroom apartment with faded blue cabinets, a second-hand dining table, and dreams that felt far larger than the space they occupied. Ethan had not always been the confident man greeting guests beneath sparkling chandeliers. There was a time when he left home before sunrise carrying a worn leather briefcase and came back exhausted after working 12-hour shifts, convinced that success was always just one promotion away. Claire never complained about the long hours. She packed his lunch every morning, slipped handwritten notes inside the paper bag, and waited until he came home before eating dinner, because she believed sharing a meal mattered more than eating on time. When money became tight, she quietly picked up extra weekend shifts at a neighborhood bookstore without telling him how tired she really was. When his old pickup truck finally gave out, she sold the vintage piano her grandmother had left her so they could afford a reliable used car. Ethan cried when he found out, promising that one day he would replace it with something even better. Claire never asked him to. She only smiled and told him that dreams were worth more than furniture. Those memories had once felt warm enough to carry her through every difficult season. They celebrated tiny victories with takeout pizza because expensive restaurants were out of reach. They spent summer evenings sitting on the apartment roof counting airplanes crossing the sky, imagining vacations they would someday take together. Whenever Ethan doubted himself, Claire reminded him that success was not measured by the size of a paycheck, but by the kind of person someone became while earning it. Somewhere along the way, those words slowly lost their place in his heart. Promotions came. Better suits replaced worn jackets. Business dinners became networking events. New friends entered his life, and old promises quietly disappeared. Claire noticed the changes one small moment at a time. Phone calls became shorter. Dinners became colder. Weekends became business trips that seemed to happen more often than before. She convinced herself every successful career demanded sacrifice, never realizing that she had become the sacrifice. One rainy evening she stayed awake until nearly midnight with a homemade dinner waiting on the stove. When Ethan finally walked through the front door, the food had long since gone cold. He barely looked at the table before saying he had already eaten with clients. It was the first time she realized that loneliness could exist even while standing beside someone you loved. She did not argue. She simply wrapped the untouched meal, placed it in the refrigerator, and whispered good night. Looking back now, Claire understood that marriages rarely fall apart in a single dramatic moment. They slowly fade beneath 1,000 quiet disappointments that nobody else can see. Standing once again inside the glowing ballroom, surrounded by strangers who believed they knew her story, Claire gently traced the edge of the folded invitation with her fingertips. None of them had witnessed those ordinary days filled with hope, sacrifice, and unwavering loyalty. They only saw the ending. They had no idea that the most important chapter of her life had not begun with losing Ethan. It had begun the moment she finally stopped believing that her worth depended on whether he chose to see it. Back inside the ballroom, laughter drifted through the air as servers carried silver trays filled with sparkling drinks, but Claire heard almost none of it. The memories had become too vivid to ignore. The day their marriage officially ended had arrived without shouting, without dramatic accusations, and without the kind of scene people expected after years together. The attorney quietly slid a stack of papers across the polished conference table, while sunlight filtered through tall office windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Ethan signed first. His hand barely hesitated. Claire watched the pen move across the paper. That represented nearly a decade of shared birthdays, sleepless nights, impossible dreams, and ordinary mornings that once felt priceless. When the documents reached her side of the table, she paused only long enough to read the date one final time before writing her own name. Neither of them argued over furniture. Neither fought over old photographs or kitchen dishes or books that had filled the shelves of the apartment where they had built their first life together. Some things had already been lost long before the signatures made it official. As they walked toward the elevator, Ethan cleared his throat as though searching for the perfect sentence to make everything less painful. Instead, he settled for something ordinary. He told her she was a good person. He said she deserved someone who could appreciate her. Claire simply nodded because she finally understood that apologies offered after love had already disappeared, were often meant to comfort the person giving them, rather than the person receiving them. Outside the building, the afternoon breeze carried the scent of fresh rain across the sidewalks. Ethan climbed into his car without looking back. Claire stood there with one medium-sized suitcase beside her, and a small shoulder bag resting against her coat. That was all she had chosen to keep. She could have taken more, but every extra possession felt heavier than it was worth. She watched his car disappear into traffic until the red taillights blended with hundreds of others moving through the city. Then she picked up her suitcase, took a slow breath, and walked toward the train station instead of calling a ride. She remembered every step of that afternoon because each one carried her farther away from the life she thought she would have forever. The first night alone was quieter than she expected. A modest furnished apartment welcomed her with plain white walls, a narrow bed, and a single window overlooking a busy street where strangers hurried home before sunset. She unpacked only the essentials: a few books, family photographs, a coffee mug with a tiny chip along the rim. She placed them carefully on the shelves, not because the apartment already felt like home, but because she believed home could be built again one thoughtful choice at a time. There were evenings when the silence seemed almost too large to bear, yet she refused to fill it with regret. Instead, she learned to enjoy simple routines that belonged only to her. Early morning walks before work, fresh coffee from the neighborhood cafe, long evenings reading novels she had postponed for years, while putting someone else's ambitions first. Piece by piece, she stopped measuring her value by the promises another person failed to keep. Standing once again beneath the glittering chandeliers, Claire gently released the edge of her folded invitation, as the faint sound of a car door closing echoed from beyond the ballroom entrance. Several valets outside straightened at once. Inside, guests continued smiling, laughing, and celebrating, completely unaware that the story they believed had ended years ago was quietly preparing to begin again. The soft murmur of conversation inside the ballroom never reached Claire as another memory quietly unfolded in her mind, not one filled with heartbreak this time, but with the slow and patient rhythm of beginning again. Recovery had not arrived like a sunrise bursting over the horizon. It had come one ordinary morning at a time. Every weekday, her alarm rang at 6 o'clock. She would lace up a comfortable pair of running shoes, walk 3 blocks through tree-lined streets still glistening with dew, and stop at the same neighborhood coffee shop where the owner learned her name after only a few weeks. The smell of fresh coffee beans and warm cinnamon pastries slowly replaced the scent of disappointment that had followed her for so long. She rented a modest apartment because it was enough. She purchased fresh flowers every Friday, not because someone else would admire them, but because they made her smile when she unlocked the front door after work. She enrolled in professional certification courses during the evenings, spending countless hours studying while rain tapped gently against the windows. There were nights when exhaustion tempted her to quit, yet every completed lesson reminded her that she was building a future no one could take away. Months gradually became years. The woman who had once measured success through another person's approval quietly discovered the confidence that grows when promises are made to oneself and faithfully kept. Friends noticed first. They remarked that she laughed more easily. Her shoulders no longer carried invisible weight. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, there was a quiet certainty in her voice that had not existed before. Claire rarely mentioned her divorce. She did not erase it from her story, but neither did she allow it to become the story. She volunteered on Saturday mornings at a local literacy program, helping children discover the joy of reading. She visited her parents more often. She learned to cook recipes she had always postponed trying because life had once been too busy revolving around someone else's schedule. Slowly, happiness stopped feeling like something waiting in the future and became something hidden inside ordinary afternoons. One crisp autumn evening after finishing a leadership seminar downtown, she stepped outside carrying a folder filled with notes while golden leaves drifted across the sidewalk. The city moved with its usual energy as office workers hurried toward parking garages and commuters disappeared into subway entrances. As Claire reached the corner, a sudden gust of wind scattered several papers from her folder across the pavement. Before she could chase them, another pair of hands calmly gathered the pages one by one. The man who handed them back wore a charcoal overcoat and carried himself with quiet confidence rather than obvious wealth. His smile was polite, almost reserved. "I think these belong to you," he said. Claire thanked him with a grateful laugh, embarrassed by the unexpected mess. He glanced at the leadership workbook resting on top of the stack. "Long day?" he asked. "A productive one," she answered. Something about the conversation felt refreshingly simple. He did not ask about her relationship status. He did not try to impress her with stories about himself. They spoke for only a few minutes before the traffic light changed. He introduced himself as Alexander. She offered her name in return. Then they wished each other a pleasant evening and walked in opposite directions as though they might never meet again. Standing beneath the glittering chandeliers years later, Claire gently remembered that chance encounter, while the grand entrance doors remained closed. Outside, unseen by nearly everyone inside the ballroom, a valet respectfully opened the rear door of the elegant black automobile, and for the first time that evening, every employee near the entrance instinctively straightened their posture. Claire had expected never to see Alexander Sterling again after that windy autumn evening, yet life has a quiet habit of arranging second chances when people are no longer searching for them. 2 weeks later she stepped into the same neighborhood coffee shop before work, and found the last empty chair occupied by the man who had rescued her scattered papers. He looked up from a hardcover book, recognized her immediately, and smiled with the same calm sincerity she remembered. "I believe this seat has been waiting for you," he said as he stood to pull out the chair. She laughed softly before accepting the invitation. Their conversation began with ordinary subjects: favorite books, hidden restaurants around the city, weekend hiking trails. Neither one tried to impress the other. Alexander listened more than he spoke, asking thoughtful questions instead of steering every conversation back to himself. Claire noticed something unusual about him. Whenever someone interrupted to greet him, he treated every person with equal respect. He thanked the barista by name. He held the door open for an elderly couple. He never looked at his watch while she spoke, making every minute together feel unhurried. Over the following months their paths crossed often enough that coincidence slowly became intention. Sometimes they shared coffee before work. Other times they wandered through museums on quiet Sunday afternoons, or attended outdoor concerts where families spread blankets across the grass beneath the summer sky. Alexander never arrived in flashy sports cars or surrounded by assistants. Most days he drove a simple luxury sedan that blended easily into downtown traffic. His clothes were well made but understated. Nothing about him suggested extraordinary wealth. Claire appreciated that. After everything she had experienced, kindness felt far more valuable than status. One evening, while watching the sunset paint the lake with shades of gold and amber, Alexander asked a question that caught her completely off guard. "What made you smile today?" It was such a simple question, yet nobody had asked her something so genuine in years. Claire thought for a moment before answering. "A little girl at the literacy program finished her first chapter book today. She looked at me like she had climbed a mountain." Alexander smiled. Then today was a good day. That was when Claire realized he measured success differently from most people she had known. He admired character more than achievements and quiet generosity more than public recognition. Months passed before she finally told him about her marriage to Ethan. She did not describe herself as a victim. She simply shared the truth with honesty and without resentment. Alexander listened without interrupting. When she finished, he remained silent for a few moments before saying something she would remember forever. "Someone else's inability to recognize your value never reduced your value. It only revealed the limits of their vision." He never criticized Ethan. He never encouraged revenge. He simply gave Claire something she had almost forgotten existed: peace. Trust returned slowly, like spring after a long winter. She discovered that love did not have to be loud to be real. Sometimes it appeared in small gestures, like a warm cup of coffee waiting outside her office on a cold morning or a handwritten note, wishing her luck before an important presentation. Long before she learned the full extent of Alexander's success, she had already fallen in love with the man he chose to be when nobody was watching. Back inside the wedding ballroom, Claire quietly remembered those moments as another faint sound echoed beyond the entrance. Through the towering glass doors, several hotel managers suddenly appeared near the front driveway, adjusting their jackets with unusual urgency. Guests remained focused on the celebration, completely unaware that someone outside had just arrived whose presence alone had transformed the composure of every employee standing at the entrance. Outside the ballroom, the evening air carried the faint scent of fresh rain as the elegant black automobile remained perfectly still beneath the entrance canopy. Uniformed valets stood respectfully beside it without speaking. Hotel managers who had spent the evening greeting guests with casual smiles suddenly adjusted their jackets and straightened their posture, as though preparing to welcome someone of extraordinary importance. Inside, however, the celebration continued untouched. Crystal glasses clinked together while the orchestra transitioned into another graceful melody. Ethan laughed with business associates who congratulated him on both his upcoming marriage and his promising career. Vanessa accepted endless compliments about her gown, her engagement ring, and the lavish ceremony that surrounded them. Claire remained exactly where she had been standing, calm and composed, her attention drifting toward the entrance only for a brief second before returning to the room. She remembered the day the wedding invitation had arrived several months earlier. The ivory envelope rested quietly inside her mailbox beneath ordinary bills and advertisements. She recognized Ethan's handwriting immediately. For several minutes she simply stared at the unopened envelope on her kitchen counter, while afternoon sunlight stretched across the wooden floor. She had no intention of attending. Some chapters, she believed, were better left unopened. That evening Alexander found the invitation beside 2 untouched cups of tea. He picked it up, read only the front, then gently placed it back on the table without asking a single question. Claire finally broke the silence. "I think they invited me because they expect me to decline." Alexander looked at her thoughtfully. "And what do you want to do?" She admitted she did not know. Part of her wanted to ignore the invitation forever. Another part quietly wondered if avoiding the past meant it still held power over her. Alexander reached across the table and lightly rested his hand over hers. "Do not go for them," he said softly. "Do not stay away because of them either. Make the choice that gives you peace." Claire searched his face. "What if people think I came to prove something?" Alexander smiled with the quiet confidence she had come to love. "The people who truly know you will never think that. The people who do not know you are not yours to convince." His answer settled something deep inside her. Days later she mailed the response card confirming her attendance. There was no excitement attached to the decision and certainly no desire for revenge. She simply refused to let fear choose for her anymore. On the afternoon of the wedding, Alexander arrived at her apartment carrying a small bouquet of white roses. He admired her navy blue dress before offering a warm smile. "You look exactly like yourself," he said. Claire laughed. "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" "It is the highest compliment I know," he answered. "You are not trying to impress anyone. You are simply showing up as the woman you became." During the drive to the hotel they spoke about everything except Ethan. They discussed a charity event scheduled for the following week, a new cafe Claire wanted to visit, and a hiking trip they hoped to take before autumn arrived. When the limousine approached the entrance, Claire noticed the growing crowd near the front doors. "Maybe we should wait a minute," she suggested. Alexander glanced through the window, noticing the congestion of arriving guests. "Go ahead without me," he said calmly. "I have a brief call to finish. I will join you in a few minutes." Claire nodded without concern because she trusted him completely. She stepped out alone, walked into the ballroom with quiet confidence, and never once imagined how differently those few minutes would soon be remembered. Outside, Alexander ended the call, slipped his phone into his pocket, and finally reached for the door handle as every employee near the entrance instinctively prepared to welcome the man whose name most of the guests inside had not yet heard. The ballroom doors opened so quietly that almost nobody noticed at first. The orchestra continued playing without missing a single note. Waiters crossed the polished floor carrying silver trays, and conversations floated through the room as effortlessly as before. Then one by one, heads began turning toward the entrance. It did not happen because someone announced a famous name or because a dramatic entrance demanded attention. It happened because every hotel employee standing near the door suddenly stepped aside with unmistakable respect. The general manager himself walked forward with a warm smile that seemed reserved for only the most distinguished guests. Alexander Sterling entered the ballroom with an unhurried stride, wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit and a simple silver watch. There was nothing loud about his appearance. No entourage followed behind him. No cameras surrounded him. His confidence required no performance because it had never depended on anyone else's approval. Several guests paused in the middle of their conversations, whispering quietly as recognition spread across the room like ripples across still water. Claire saw him immediately. Their eyes met for only a moment before he offered the same gentle smile he had given her on that windy autumn evening when they first met outside the leadership seminar. It was a smile that always reminded her she never had to prove herself. Ethan noticed the movement near the entrance and casually turned his head, expecting another late guest. Instead, he frowned slightly. The man looked strangely familiar, although he could not remember where he had seen him before. Vanessa leaned closer and quietly asked, "Do you know him?" Ethan slowly shook his head. "I do not think so." Nearby, two executives from a financial firm exchanged surprised glances before immediately straightening their jackets. An elderly couple who had been speaking with the bride's parents politely excused themselves and began walking toward the entrance with genuine enthusiasm. The chairman of a charitable foundation abandoned his conversation halfway through a sentence just to greet the newcomer. None of it made sense to Ethan. He watched as people he considered influential suddenly behaved like honored hosts welcoming someone far more important than themselves. Alexander acknowledged each greeting with warmth but never allowed the attention to slow his pace. He thanked the hotel manager with a handshake, smiled politely at familiar faces, and continued walking across the ballroom with calm purpose. Claire remained exactly where she was. She did not wave. She did not call his name. She simply waited. When Alexander finally reached her, he looked at her with quiet affection before saying, "I am sorry I kept you waiting." Claire smiled. "Only a few minutes." He gently offered his arm, and she accepted it naturally, as though the elegant ballroom around them had disappeared and they were simply two people continuing an ordinary evening together. The simple gesture caught the attention of nearly everyone nearby. Vanessa's smile slowly faded. Ethan stared at Claire's hand resting comfortably on Alexander's arm, trying to understand what he was seeing. He had expected Claire to arrive alone. He had expected awkwardness, perhaps even sadness. Instead, she stood with complete peace beside a man who seemed to command effortless respect from people Ethan had spent years trying to impress. Across the room, whispers became impossible to ignore. One guest quietly spoke Alexander's name. Another repeated it with visible surprise. A third guest immediately reached for a phone, not to take a photograph, but to confirm something online. Ethan's expression gradually shifted from curiosity to uncertainty. Somewhere deep inside, a feeling he could not yet explain began settling into his chest. He still had no idea who Alexander Sterling truly was, but for the first time that evening, he realized the story he believed he understood was about to change in ways he had never imagined. The whispers grew louder with every passing second, yet Alexander seemed completely unaware of the attention surrounding him. He remained focused only on Claire, asking quietly whether she had enjoyed the ceremony so far. She smiled and admitted that it had been an interesting evening. Before either of them could continue, the chairman of Sterling Global Foundation approached with a broad smile and extended both hands. "Alexander, I was hoping you would make it tonight," he said warmly. "The board has been asking when you plan to return to Chicago." Alexander greeted him with genuine familiarity before introducing Claire with unmistakable pride. "This is my wife, Claire." The chairman immediately turned toward her with sincere respect. "It is an honor to finally meet you. Alexander speaks of you far more than he ever speaks about business, and that is saying something." Claire thanked him graciously while nearby conversations gradually faded into complete silence. Ethan stood frozen several yards away. Sterling. The name echoed in his mind. He had heard it countless times during executive meetings at Carter Financial Consulting. Just 3 months earlier, his company had celebrated winning a consulting contract connected to Sterling Capital Holdings, one of the largest privately owned investment groups in the country. The entire office had spent weeks preparing reports because everyone understood that impressing the chairman of the Sterling organization could transform careers. Ethan had studied company profiles, annual reports, and organizational charts late into the night. The name Alexander Sterling had appeared on nearly every presentation. He had simply never seen him in person. Vanessa noticed Ethan's expression changing. "What is wrong?" she whispered. Ethan answered without taking his eyes off Alexander. "I know who he is." Her smile slowly disappeared. Across the ballroom, another distinguished guest approached Alexander, followed by the chief executive officer of a major hospital network, a federal judge known throughout the city, and 2 prominent philanthropists. None of them behaved as though greeting a wealthy businessman alone. They greeted him as a trusted friend whose opinion genuinely mattered. Every introduction carried the same tone of respect that money alone could never purchase. The bride's father hurried over with visible excitement, apologizing that he had not realized Alexander had accepted the invitation. Hotel staff quietly replaced the table originally assigned to Claire with one much closer to the front, but Alexander thanked them kindly and requested that everything remain exactly as planned. "My wife is comfortable where she is," he said. "That is all that matters." Those simple words landed with far greater weight than any display of status ever could. Claire looked at him with quiet affection because this was the same man who carried groceries without being asked, remembered her favorite bakery, and never forgot to call her parents on holidays. His kindness had never changed simply because other people recognized his name. Ethan felt an uncomfortable realization settle over him. For years he had measured success through titles, promotions, and recognition, believing those achievements would prove his worth. Yet the man standing beside Claire possessed every accomplishment Ethan had chased, and somehow carried them with complete humility. Vanessa tightened her grip on Ethan's arm, sensing the atmosphere shifting around them. Guests who had barely acknowledged Claire earlier now greeted her with genuine warmth, not because she demanded attention, but because they finally understood who stood beside her. Claire accepted every greeting with the same gentle smile she had worn all evening. She neither celebrated the sudden admiration nor resented the people who had overlooked her before. Watching her, Ethan understood something that no business seminar had ever taught him. Claire had not become extraordinary because she married Alexander Sterling. She had always possessed quiet dignity. The only difference was that now everyone else could finally see what he had failed to value when it had been his greatest blessing. The music resumed, conversations slowly returned, and the wedding continued exactly as it had been planned. Yet something invisible had changed forever inside the ballroom. Claire did not notice the lingering stares because she was no longer living for the opinions of strangers. She quietly thanked the guests who greeted her with kindness, exchanged a few warm conversations, and remained exactly the same woman she had been when she first walked through the entrance alone. Alexander never once mentioned his accomplishments. Whenever someone praised his business success, he redirected the conversation toward the charitable projects his foundation supported or introduced Claire with unmistakable admiration, allowing every compliment to settle gently upon the woman beside him instead of himself. Ethan watched everything unfold from across the room with a strange mixture of disbelief and regret. For the first time in many years, he saw Claire without the distorted lens of pride or familiarity. He remembered the handwritten notes she used to place inside his lunch bag, the weekends she worked extra hours without complaint, the evenings she patiently listened while he talked about ambitions that had once seemed impossible. None of those memories had disappeared. He had simply buried them beneath promotions, recognition, and the illusion that success always required leaving something behind. Now he understood that what he had left behind had never been holding him back. It had been quietly holding him together. Vanessa sensed the distance growing between herself and Ethan. She followed his gaze toward Claire more than once before gently touching his arm. He forced a polite smile, but his attention never truly returned to the celebration. Across the ballroom, Alexander leaned toward Claire and asked whether she was ready to leave whenever she wished. She nodded with a peaceful smile. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to revisit. The past had finally become exactly where it belonged. Before they walked toward the exit, Ethan crossed the room with slow, uncertain steps. The confidence that had carried him throughout the evening had quietly disappeared. When he reached Claire, he hesitated for a brief moment before speaking. "Claire," he said softly, "I am glad life has been kind to you." She looked at him with genuine warmth rather than triumph. "Thank you, Ethan. I hope life is kind to you as well." There was no hidden meaning. No sarcasm. No attempt to make him feel smaller. Those simple words somehow carried more grace than any victory speech ever could. Alexander extended his hand. Ethan accepted it automatically. "Congratulations," Ethan said. Alexander smiled politely. "Thank you. Take good care of the future. You are building." It was an ordinary sentence, yet Ethan heard something deeper within it. The future could never be built by regretting the past. As Claire and Alexander turned toward the grand entrance, the orchestra began another gentle melody that followed them through the ballroom like a quiet farewell. The hotel staff opened the doors, cool evening air drifted inside, and the lights of downtown Chicago shimmered beyond the driveway. Alexander offered his arm once again, and Claire accepted it with the same natural ease that had filled every day of their marriage. They stepped outside together without looking back. Inside, the celebration continued, but Ethan remained standing where they had left him, watching the doors slowly close. He finally understood that the greatest loss of his life had never been a failed marriage. It had been failing to recognize the extraordinary woman standing beside him while he still had the chance. Claire never returned to reclaim the man who had once walked away. She returned as the woman who had reclaimed herself. And in that quiet moment, beneath the fading music and the glow of the city lights, dignity spoke louder than regret ever could.